Hello, Carl Stevens here. This is my presentation on American Church, which is a response to the Ascending the Tower podcast, You Have to Baptize Cowboys. This presentation is of 3 parts. The first part is a brief history of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. The second part is a tour of some churches in Milwaukee. And the third part is some comments about an Americanite church and Americanism. This picture that we have here is just a picture from last Sunday's Mass. It was a Packer game that day. Just kidding, this is Lambeau Field. But people dress the same for church and Packer games. So you wouldn't be able to have known the difference unless I would have told you. So thankfully I did. Anyway, the early history of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee was that of attempts of German American bishops to preserve Milwaukee's German cultural inheritance and German Catholic traditions. The guiding aphorism was that of language preserves faith, as it was foreseen that the adoption of American English language and customs would result in apostasy. In fact, the Archdiocese of Milwaukee was the headquarters of the conservative wing of the American Church, whereas the bishops of the East Coast, such as Cardinal Gibbons, or just to the west of us here in Milwaukee, the Archbishop of Minnesota, John Ireland, promoted establishing an American Catholic Church. The bishops of Milwaukee wanted a German church in America. This project was disrupted by new waves of immigration into the Archdiocese, especially Polish and Italians, and later Irish. The new project was enclave churches. There would be a Polish church for Poles, an Italian church for Italians, while the German churches would remain German. To the left in this slide, we have the Know Nothing ticket. It was a nativist American party contemporaneous with the formation of the German church in Milwaukee. You can see right here that they advertise eternal hostility to foreign and Roman Catholic influence. So America historically had always been anti-Catholic, and the aforementioned controversy between the conservative American bishops in Milwaukee and the other bishops was that of how best to engage with a hostile culture. But the project of a German American church, besides being disrupted by immigration, was interrupted by World War I. So, in the next century, Milwaukee's German character was actively curtailed due to the world wars. Before America's entrance into World War I, the citizens of Milwaukee supported the Central Powers. German families would send money and medical supplies to the fatherland, and Wisconsin's congressmen strongly argued for neutrality in the war. After America's entrance, German identity in Milwaukee was suppressed. Frankfurters became hot dogs, sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, Germans anglicized their last names, the Germania building, on the right-hand of the screen, was renamed, and a statue of Lady Germania was removed. German vilification during World War II cemented these trends. A German church in America became untenable. I particularly enjoy the propaganda poster in the middle, where you see this German ape with his culture club kidnapping this beautiful Anglo woman. It's kind of how I got my wife. However, enclave churches continued to be the norm until the 1-2 punch of the reforms of Vatican II and the race crisis of the Civil Rights era. It is well known that Vatican II preceded a demographic disaster for the Catholic Church in America and elsewhere, but it also precipitated the wholesale abandonment of the Catholic cultural heritages in Milwaukee. Churches were renovated, removing high altars and cultural iconography. Favorite hymns were scrapped for contemporary folksy tunes, featuring bongo drums and guitars. And the introduction of the Novus Ordo rite was a rupture with centuries of liturgical tradition. The destruction of cultural inheritance was worsened by declining birth rates due to the use of the pill. Not only were German and Polish churches less German and Polish, but there were less Germans and Poles to attend them. The second catastrophe for enclave churches was white flight from the city to the suburbs. The older German or Polish areas of the city today have become Hispanic, Black, and in recent times, hipster. This began with a wave of Black immigration from the South after the Second World War. Some had thought that the new Black immigrants would establish Black enclave churches, but this was impolitic due to the social struggle to desegregate the rest of society. The diocese voluntarily integrated urban schools in concert with forced integration of public schools, while churches were encouraged to modify their identities to become more appealing to minorities, Blacks, and now Hispanics. The result was that German and Polish neighborhoods were abandoned, and with the loss of people, German and Polishes ceased to be enclave churches. As our Lord has said, if salt loses its saltiness, with what will it be salted? It is good for nothing, except to be thrown out and trod underfoot. Therefore, it is not surprising that the Catholic Church is not doing so well in Milwaukee. There are many factors which have caused this state of affairs, but I would say that a major contributing factor has been the loss of European cultural identity that has occurred and continues to occur in the diocese. It is anticipated that the diocese will need to close at least 50% of churches in Milwaukee in the next 10 to 15 years, and in fact, this has already begun, with many churches being reorganized as multi-site parishes due to lack of priests, because there are very few vocations, and financial pressures. On this slide, we see demographic makeup of the city of Milwaukee, which is one of the most racially segregated cities in America. The green areas are where the African Americans live. The blue areas are where the white people live. And the orange are where Hispanics live. The orange areas used to be German, and the green areas were more Polish. Here is the second part of our presentation. In this slide, we see a magnificent church in South Milwaukee, now in a Mexican neighborhood, St. Anthony's. There is beautiful woodworking made by German immigrants, and there's still some Germans or white people that go here in one of the masses. They also offer a more traditional Novus Ordo rite, featuring even confessions during Mass. This church is the Basilica of St. Joseph's. It is one of the landmarks in Milwaukee and a fine example of the Polish cathedral style of architecture. Here is the interior. Absolutely magnificent. Really leaves you speechless. There's a beautiful Tenebrae service that happens here every Lent, where they have all the lights turned off, well, except for some candle lights, and as a choir sings through the Lamentations of Jeremiah, the candles are slowly extinguished until the cathedral is dark. This church is St. Casimir's in the north part of Milwaukee. This was a Polish church, and I happen to have been married here. There's also very fine woodwork. You can see an example of a high altar, and how in the front they just have a table altar, which is not even in the same style. Fairly common in these old churches. And I think because they wanted to switch styles of altar, in many churches they decided to rip out the high altar. Thankfully, that did not occur here. This picture is an older picture from the 50s, I believe, of St. Stanislav's, which is a Polish church in South Milwaukee. Also in the Polish cathedral style. Very orderly and seems like a nice place. Here it is today. They did renovate this church, but it was acquired by the Institute of Christ the King, and they tried to fix it up to its former glory. The differences that still carry over from the renovation are the new geometric design of the stained glass windows, whereas before they had figures in them. Here's a German church, old of St. Mary's, in the center part of downtown Milwaukee. It's a very pretty church. Here's an interesting parish now. It's called Three Holy Women. But what you have are three churches, all within 1 mile of one another, or maybe 1.5 miles, I don't know. But you have St. Hedwig's, which was Polish. You have Holy Rosary in the upper right-hand corner, which was Irish. And you have an Italian church, St. Rita's, on the bottom right-hand of the slide. Both Holy Rosary and St. Rita's did not escape renovation. And you can kind of see churches you're probably more used to seeing out in the suburbs. Not a lot to say about St. Rita's, I guess. Though St. Hedwig's is still beautiful in a more subdued manner. Here is St. John the Evangelist, which is the primary cathedral in Milwaukee, the seat of the Archbishop. This is the first renovation of the cathedral because there was a fire that burned and destroyed most of the cathedral. I think it was in mid-century. It's not as pretty as some of the ethnic churches, and for churches that are built today, this is probably as pretty as you would get because of the recommendations and the Vatican II documents about how to build future churches and not to just stock them full of beautiful artwork. I think that was done to appeal to Protestants. This is the former Archbishop of Milwaukee, Jerome Listecki, who is famous for several things. Firstly, he was a sodomite who used Archdiocese funds to pay off one of his homosexual lovers, to remain silent about the fact that they were lovers, but also for excavating the Cathedral of St. John's. Here is the cathedral as you would see it today. High altar is gone in the back, replaced by the organ. It's a nice organ, but it's no high altar. You have the table altar in the middle, and the congregation stands around it, so it's kind of an awkward place for an altar. And you have this really ugly, bizarre hanging statue, which is nightmare-inducing. Could be a set piece for an Aliens movie. There's also no tabernacle in sight. To get to the tabernacle, you'd have to go down a hallway leading to the right-hand side of the church from this view. There is enough room for maybe 4 people to kneel and face the tabernacle and pray, which is probably all the room you need for a given day, given how few people actually go to the church to pray during the day. Here's Father Grappi, who was a famous social justice warrior during the Milwaukee race riot days. He ended up leaving the priesthood, and he and a few of his clerical friends were strong advocates of churches trying to appeal more to African Americans and not setting up enclave churches. On this slide, we'll see a picture of the Congregation of the Great Spirit in Milwaukee. It's now a Native American style church, as you might have guessed from the dream catcher hanging above the altar. I'm not sure that the Catholic Church officially endorses dream catchers as a mode of exorcism, but it is in the Congregation of the Great Spirit. In the picture on the right, you can see everybody standing around a drum circle where they do Native American drumming and chants as a goodbye song after doing the Mass. The other interesting thing that they do here, besides all of the boisterous music, which some people like, is they'll have tobacco that they burn as incense, and they kind of wave it into your face so you can get a whiff of the tobacco and cedar, I think. Having trouble playing the video, but if you're to Google honoring the water congregation of the Great Spirit water ceremony, you can see what a typical service is like here in the church. The service in the video is not a Mass, but it gives you a flavor of what a Mass is like. Now, this church is called Our Lady of Guadalupe. Now, it's a Hispanic church in Milwaukee, but it used to be a German church. I'm glad that somebody is using it. Now on to the third part of our presentation on American religious identity. There are 2 aspects to American religious identity that I would like to observe. First, the American civil religion and our charismatic heritage, starting with revivalism and ending in evangelicalism. So the American civil religion has been famously described in Robert Bella's paper, Civil Religion in America. And in that paper, he talks about the rights and the sacred heroes and and objects and ideas and doctrines of the American civil religion. However, we will only consider the following landmarks of our national creed in this presentation, and those are the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, and the Declaration of Independence. None of these are particularly pliable to adoption by the traditional Catholic faith. The Founding Fathers were mainly Masons, and the Constitution does not recognize the kingship of Christ or obedience to his vicar in Rome. And the Declaration of Independence is born from a conception of authority alien to the gospel. Historically, liberalism, the classical liberalism of the Founding Fathers, to be more specific, had always been identified as an error and sinful. Interested readers would be referred to the Syllabus of Errors and the encyclicals Quanta Cora by Pope Pius IX, the encyclical Mirari Vos by Pope Gregory XVI, or any of the following encyclicals by Pope Leo XIII on human liberty, on the evils of modern society, on the sex of the socialists, communists, and nihilists, on Christian philosophy, on matrimony, on the origin of civil power, on Freemasonry, on the Christian state, on the Christian life, on the chief duties of a Christian citizen, on the social question, or his masterwork, Rerum Novarum. All of those encyclicals contain condemnations of liberalism. I'd also like to point out that Freemasons, which kind of promulgate liberal doctrines, and the Catholic Church were at war throughout most of the 19th century and before, so the Jacobites were Freemasons, and the French Revolution was largely anti-clerical. The Italian Revolution, where the modern state of Italy was formed, was Masonic. Garibaldi was a Grand Master Mason, largely anti-clerical. There was a Spanish Civil War, which was inspired by Masonry and was largely anti-clerical. And when I say anti-clerical, I mean that there was concerted efforts by leftists to murder priests and or nuns. In fact, the terror in France was probably ended by the disgust of the Parisian citizens when the French government murdered a whole convent of Carmelites by chopping their head off with the guillotine. And from reports, it was probably a pretty interesting execution because all the nuns were singing their ordination song, and they continued singing even while their sisters were getting their heads chopped off, and their singing finally ended when the last sister's head was lopped off. The other major Masonic revolutions were, well, besides the American, but there weren't an appreciable number of Catholics in America, so it wasn't terribly anti-clerical, but the revolution in Mexico was. Now, since Catholics can never accept the political or philosophical origins of the American state, an Americanite Catholic Church must then stand opposed to its American heritage. That is to say that it ought to operate as a political faction which works to replace the prevailing culture by missionary activity and willingness to be martyred. A historical model for the kind of church I have in mind would be the early church in pagan Rome. Catholics ought not participate in American civil society or its festivals, and this should be what marks the church as Americanite. Pope Leo XIII was clear in his letter to Cardinal Gibbons, cautioning against the Americanist heresy that any American church must also be fundamentally subject to the Roman Pontiff. That is to say, that American Catholics are firstly subject to the authority of the Pope and not to the American Republic, and that American Catholics must find their politics in the teachings and counsels of the Church, and never accept the errors of separation of church and state or religious liberty. The Americanist heresy was born from the interpretation of the life of the work of the founder of the Paulist, Father Isaac Hecker, seen in the bottom middle of the slide. And so there was a famous biography of Father Isaac Hecker, and French liberal Catholics wrote an introduction to this biography when it was translated into French. And these French liberals believed that Father Hecker taught that it was expedient for Catholics in a liberal society to de-emphasize the differences between what the Church taught and what the modern world expected, and even further, that the Church should reconcile itself with the liberalism of the American Republic. Whether these French thought that this of Father Hecker accurately or not, I cannot say, but I would say that these liberal Catholics wanted to extend this reconciliation even towards a false ecumenicism, wherein the Church would be working to establish points of commonality with Protestant sects for the purposes of mere coexistence, and not necessarily to bring them home to Rome. Pope Leo XIII condemned and cautioned any acceptance of a liberalized Catholicism that an American church might involve. So on this slide, on the left, we have Pope Leo XIII. On the right, we have Cardinal Gibbons, and we already talked about Father Isaac Hecker. But on the top, we have Orestes Bronson, who was an American transcendentalist who converted to the Catholic faith and was instrumental in the Christian formation of Father Isaac Hecker. And I selected this picture of Orestes Bronson for this quote, where he says, "I love the Irish for their attachment to the faith and for many amiable qualities, but they are deficient in good sense, sound judgment, and manly character." Now, he said this because the time he lived, there were many Irish immigrants coming over to America, and it was Orestes Bronson's hope that this influx of Irish would help convert Protestant America to Catholicism. And we see a parallel situation here today in America with our Hispanic immigrants who come from largely Catholic backgrounds, and the hopes of some Catholics today that these Hispanic immigrants will help Catholicize America. Didn't work with the Irish, probably not going to work with the Hispanics. I also wanted to bring attention to the foremost and most famous of all the proponents of Americanism, John F. Kennedy, specifically in his address to the Houston Ministers' Conference, wherein he said that he believed in an America where separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president how to act, and where no church or church school is granted public funds or political preference. He also said that He would hope for an America that is neither Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish, where no public official requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope. And he also espoused for religious indifferentism. And he did that in hopes of trying to promote the American ideal of brotherhood, which is Masonic. Contrary to liberalism and indifferentism and Americanism, I've selected a few quotes from various popes, specifically Pope Gregory XVIII and Pope Pius IX. Those watching this video may read them for themselves. Those listening, I'll read a couple. So Pope Gregory XVI says, "And so from this rotten source of indifferentism flows that absurd and erroneous opinion, or rather insanity, that liberty of conscience must be claimed and defended for anyone. For surely you know, venerable brethren, not a few are found who apply," well, that's another quote, I'm sorry. So Pope Pius IX says, "For surely you know, venerable brothers, not a few are found who, applying the impious and absurd principles of naturalism, as they call it, to civil society, dare to teach that the best plan for public society and civil progress absolutely requires that human society be established and governed with no regard to religion, as if it did not exist, or at least without making distinction between the true and false religions." This same Pope says later, "And also, contrary to the teaching of sacred scripture of the Church and of the most holy fathers, they do not hesitate to assert that the best condition of society is the one in which there is no acknowledgement by the government of the duty of restraining, by established penalties, offenders of the Catholic religion, except insofar as the public peace demands." So what he's saying there is that it is the duty of the state to penalize offenders of the Catholic religion, even going beyond what is required for the public peace. Here's a picture of an American bald eagle and the flag and the Constitution, all hallmarks of the American civil religion. The leftovers of American religious culture, which are not immediately bound up in the American civil religion, are materialism and consumerism, which have found an expression in the prosperity gospel, so-called, Protestantism, which insofar as it is Protestant, is incompatible with Catholicism, of course, and charismatic religion, the charismatic flavor of religion born in America with its snake handling, speaking in tongues, altar calls, lay blessings, spirit healings, praise and worship, rock music. Well, these have all been adopted by the Catholic Church to some degree or another in the last 3 decades, and many important Catholic intellectuals see the future of the Church as a whole in evangelical Catholicism, which is the title of a book by George Weigel, the famous news columnist and biographer of JP2. Now, didn't figure out how to get YouTube videos to play, but if you want to see a prime example of American religion at its finest, Google "New Birth crowns Eddie Long as king," and you will see something that you will never forget. It is a wonderful video, thoroughly entertaining, and I strongly recommend everyone to view it. For a taste of what evangelical Catholicism looks like, you might visit the Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. Evangelical Catholicism has the following marks. There's a cult of youth, there is emotionalism, and fractiousness. The first two marks are easily witnessed by attending an evangelical Catholic event, or you might YouTube World Youth Day or the Steubenville Youth Conferences, and you'll see what all of that is about. The fractiousness of these events is evidenced by the fact that these evangelical Catholics tend to be cliquish, and they draw away young adults from what would be their natural home parishes to attend young adult masses at select parishes. And you might have people driving 45 minutes to passing their local churches to go to these young adult masses. But that might not be all that of a bad thing, considering most parishes are liberal hellholes that need to cease to exist. And so it is not surprised that people who actually care about the faith tend to form communities outside of these parishes. Nevertheless, the cult of youth that evangelical Catholicism embraces is alien to the Christian faith, which had always, up until Vatican II, emphasized continuity with the fathers, both the church fathers and the individual community's heritage. The apostolic nature of the faith privileges the young, or privileges the old over the young, since it is the old who must hand the faith to the young. And this is impossible if the old and the young do not have spiritual relations with one another. Emotionalism suggests spiritual immaturity and weakens one to temptation and demonic deceptions. I am referring to what the Orthodox call prelist, and it is odd that everyone in a young Catholic adult group has a testimony and or conversion story, just like any young adult in a non-denominational church, even though these people are cradle Catholics mostly. The last thing I'll say about evangelical Catholicism is that its emotionalism tends to breed effeminacy and infantilization, does not foster manly virtue. One popular praise and worship song consists of the lyrics, "I need you," repeated over and over ad nauseum, and the author of the song said he was inspired by the way in which a baby needs his daddy. So I, for one, do not imagine heaven as being coddled by Jesus for all eternity, and I would rather kneel and honor the King as befits a man, but I'm a very prideful person. Anyway, for a culture to survive, there needs to be a distinct hierarchy, as you well know, both for order and the transmission of that culture to future generations. Both of these are impossible without men, real men, not effeminate men, capon priests or organists. And to that end, I cannot recommend the uniquely American religious heritage as being adopted by any Americanist church. Now, the good parts of the American identity that I have not mentioned are self-reliance and industriousness. I think that both of these can be adopted by the church, but did not our European forefathers have these self-same qualities without the baggage of Freemasonry and liberalism? I hope so. Perhaps not best to try to construct an American identity from the American heritage that we face today, either the historical heritage of Protestant cowboys or the sport ball and drinking beer culture, which consists of culture today. Now, faced with the current and impending crises, the Archdiocese of Milwaukee and other dioceses in Milwaukee facing similar situations, the task at hand for authentic Catholics is to reestablish a more traditional identity. We need to revive our ancient liturgies and observances. And to this end, concerned persons might do things like celebrate feast days. You could throw a party for your friends or family on feasts such as the Feast of Christ the King. You could celebrate your name day instead of your birthday. You could celebrate the feast of the saint who is your confirmation saint, or any saint that you have devotion to. If you want to build an American church, then we need to inculcate devotion to American saints in our areas. We need to learn about them, talk about them to your friends, pray for their intercession, etc. The so-called Orthodox churches, Greeks and Russians, despite their issues, did not have a Vatican II and have preserved their traditions more so than we have, so they have a leg up on Catholics in this regard. Therefore, it is important to try to convert them so as to help us regain our traditions by injecting their devotional life into our local communities. But I would say that the best advice I could give any American interested in founding a so-called Americanite church is to be an American saint yourself and inspire other people to imitate you and your devotions. Goodbye, and may God bless us all and all of our departed brothers and sisters.